Hello there, and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. On the one hand, people rejoice when government tells them how many jobs they've created. On the other hand, too many government jobs rather, and we start to lose track of who's really in charge. In other words, who really is the boss and who is the servant. We're going to talk about why that relationship matters, again, from the perspective of a legislator. I think you'll be very interested in what Senator Glenita Zuiderveld has to say.
All reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy.
Once again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde, and it seems so much of our politics, we lose track of what exactly were we fighting about in the first place. And this is true sometimes when a big legislative battle is taking place at the State House and, a particular piece of policy is making its way through. Sometimes it feels like it just becomes about winning. And that's when it's good to remind ourselves that, okay, there's a proper role for government to play. And there's a necessary role. And actually, it's a huge blessing when it does play that role. But unfortunately, we always see these tendencies to want to expand it beyond what it's supposed to be doing. And this is a source of great mischief and not a small amount of pain for us, particularly in the pocketbook. So I was very interested in Glenita Zuiderveld. She's the senator for, I believe, District 25. She had a very good article about what happens when government is the boss. But I want you to see how she starts this out, because she uses an example that I think most people could relate to at some level. She says, imagine a town where nearly everyone works for the same employer, not a company, but the government. The mayor signs their paychecks, the state decides their raises, their livelihoods, mortgages, and children's futures all rest in the hands of elected officials and agency heads. Now, imagine what happens when someone in that town starts asking hard questions about spending, policies, government growth. Suddenly, those questions don't just challenge ideas, they challenge incomes. A vote against bloated appropriation isn't seen as fiscal responsibility. It's seen as threatening someone's job. Dissent becomes dangerous. Speaking up becomes risky. That's the danger when government becomes the largest employer. Now, again, I think you can see what she's saying here. So she actually has a proverb to back this up. When the people depend on the government for everything, they're no longer free. We see this in varying degrees in some of the nation's communities. So let's walk through a couple of the reasons why Glenita says this is why grassroots politics and grassroots involvement still matters in Idaho. She says, as an elected official, it often feels like I'm always preparing for the next campaign. With Idaho legislators facing re-election every 2 years, there's little time to catch your breath. And if someone wants to challenge or plans to challenge an incumbent, the challenger is already filing paperwork and raising funds before the session even ends. This cycle, she says, has become the norm, and it's getting more expensive by the year. And she actually shows a very interesting graph that shows in her last race, her challenger and those backing her spent an astonishing $261,226 trying to defeat her. Now, Glenita says, I was blessed to raise $65,000 entirely thanks to the unwavering support of grassroots Idahoans, hardworking men and women who believe in people over politics. Together, we proved that trust, truth, and community matter more than big money. But let's delve a little deeper into the problem here. Here's how Glenita describes the Goliath that we're up against. She says, running as a grassroots candidate in Idaho isn't easy. One of the biggest obstacles is that the state of Idaho is the largest sole employer in the state. More than 24,000 people are employed by state government, and that includes thousands in public institutions like Boise State University. That much power in the hands of one employer creates a very serious problem because employment becomes political. Legislators who vote against bloated budgets or new government positions often face backlash, not on policy grounds, but because they're seen as threatening jobs. And she points out that's not accountability, that's coercion. And it begs the question, is government just a big jobs program? Because for some, it kind of becomes that way. How about the private sector? St. Luke's Health System is the largest private employer in Idaho with more than 16,000 employees. Even giants like Micron Technology in Boise employ only about 5,500 people in state. Nationally, it's no different. Largest overall employer, it's the federal government, roughly 3 million employees. Largest private employer, that would be Walmart with 1.6 million roughly. Runner-up is Amazon, 1.1 million. But as Glenita points out here, this is not just about numbers, okay? This is about freedom. Now here's her reasoning. Power becomes centralized when more people work for the government. When the state holds the paycheck, it also holds the power. Independence, in turn, can breed silence. People who rely on the government for their livelihood often find themselves biting their tongues, fearing the consequences of challenging those in control. I mean, it's not just policy anymore, it's personal. Bureaucracy grows, efficiency shrinks without the checks and balances of profit and loss, which is how businesses are held accountable. The government machine grows, departments multiply, red tape thickens. And the taxpayers don't see the results, they just see the bill. And that bill, as she points out, gets bigger every single year. Politics also gets personal. Glenita points out in the halls of the Capitol, votes should be guided by principle. But when jobs are on the line, okay, now those votes become emotional. Legislators are pressured to approve spending, not because it's right, but because saying no might hurt someone's career or cost them re-election. And so the private sector gets squeezed and small businesses struggle to compete as government employment rises. Entrepreneurs can't match government benefits, innovation slows, risk-taking dries up, and the economic diversity that makes a state strong begins to wither. So what does it lead? Well, there are some historical examples that she gives. History's told us when the government becomes the boss, and owns everything, or at least as much as it can. Well, you see, like in the Soviet Union, where nearly everyone worked for the state, but the cost was enormous with widespread corruption, zero innovation, and eventually collapse. Or Venezuela, public jobs became tools of political control. People were forced to pay or to trade their freedom for survival. Now they live with hyperinflation, poverty, and censorship. Or in Cuba, for example, where the government still dominates the workforce. What's left? Limited opportunity, stifled creativity, deeply suppressed liberty. So, the fallout's always the same when the state plays too big of a role in the economy. Stagnant economies, crushing debt and taxes, silenced dissent, mass unemployment when the system fails, eroded creativity, ambition, and freedom. And we're not there yet, she says, but we're closer than we think. When government becomes the boss, liberty becomes negotiable. That's why we have to protect our right to question, to say no, to vote with principle, to stand on conviction, even when it's unpopular, because she says, once government controls the paycheck, it's just a matter of time before it controls the person. Now, this is coming from a state legislator, and I can't speak to every legislator as to are they tempted by power, but to me, it sounds like Glenita has a very good understanding of what happens with power and why it has to be kept in check. If not, you start using it for your own benefit, and a little power must be good. Well, more power would be even better. And so people just tend to go off on power trips. This is why it's so important that government is watched at every turn, that every piece of legislation be applied to a matrix of some sorts. Is it going to grow, or is it going to shrink government? Is it going to raise the cost, or is it going to lower the cost? Will it enlarge my freedoms, or is it going to constrict my freedoms in pursuit of some greater good? And not just, the laws, the policy bills themselves, but the spending bills, because that's what funds how government operates. Aren't you glad you have some people who are actually paying attention to this and making sense of it? If you haven't checked out the Idaho Freedom Index, please go to idahofreedom.org, and you will see every possible bit of legislation that came up in the last session, as well as the good, the bad, and how your representatives voted on it. So, yeah, it seems like, well, that's a lot of work. But so, yes, the price of staying informed, the price of staying active, and of using your influence wisely, it's always going to be some work. That's why more people aren't doing it. But now you have one fewer excuse as to why you shouldn't be doing it, if for no other reason, as Senator Glenita Zeiderveld has warned, because when we don't, then the state becomes the boss. That's almost always a surefire recipe for unhappiness somewhere down the road. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
All reporters are biased. The Idaho Press Club are biased. All media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
Indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy.